With that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Leanna Schooley. She is the Executive Director of TCU's Center for Texas Studies. Good morning.
Good morning, Linda. And welcome to everyone who is in the process of joining us right now. We welcome you to the Preserving Our Past lecture series. We are able to bring you speakers like Dr. Thompson through the generosity of the Summerlee Foundation and the Summerfield G. Roberts Foundation. We're very grateful for that. They support our interest in being able to share information about preserving one's own past. And we try to share tools that will allow folks to be able to do that, whether it's through preservation or family history or local history. And I think today's presentation will be an interesting perspective on that. Now, I want to mention that next month's program will be May the 1st. Our guest will be Libby Willis, and she will be talking about her experience with the Oakhurst National Register Historic District. And she's going to talk about what goes on, how to create it, but then what goes on once you've accomplished your goal. Your interest in preserving your historic fabric of the neighborhood goes well beyond just getting the designation. So she's going to talk about creation and maintenance of a historic district. So join us for that, May 1st, 10:30. You'll be getting information about that if you're on our lists, or if you follow us on Instagram or Facebook, which I encourage you to do if you don't do it already. Also, I want to mention that for today, a little housekeeping. If you would, you are welcome to ask questions at any point during the program, but we will save those questions until the end. And if you would, please post them in the Q&A section, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that Q&A and pose your question, and we will make sure that Dr. Thompson gets to answer it towards the end. Also, I want to mention that both of the Bass Reeves books that have been published are going to be for sale through the TCU bookstore. They are offering a discount to all of you on signed copies. So I'm going to be posting that link in the chat just shortly, as soon as we get underway here. And then you can click on that, order your signed copies of Dr. Thompson's book today. This is the best we can do as far as a virtual book signing. So with that, let me tell you a little about our speaker. Dr. Thompson is a writing consultant for the Adams Center for Writing. And he serves as the center's liaison between the Bright Divinity School. He teaches writing for the English department and African American literature for the Masters of Liberal Arts program. He holds a PhD in American fiction with specializations in creative writing and African American narratives, and an MFA in creative writing of fiction. Now, he is the author of the two Bass Reeves books that we're going to be talking about today, Follow the Angels, Follow the Doves, and the latest one, Hell on the Border. Now, that first book, which is, as I think you know, based on African-American lawman Bass Reeves, is a finalist for 2 awards, the 2021 Oklahoma Book Award for Fiction, from the Oklahoma Center for the Book, and the 2021 Spur Award for Historical Fiction, and that's from the Western Writers of America. And congratulations on those, Dr. Thompson.
Thank you.
Now that Hell on the Border is out right now, it's fairly new, but he's also written other books, You, We, Poems from a Father, and Sideshow, winner of Forward Magazine's Silver Award for a short story collection. And his fiction and poetry and even nonfiction have received numerous awards and appeared in literary journals and anthologies. Now, Now, he is not a native Texan. He grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, but has joined us at TCU, and we're very glad to have him. So with that, I give you Dr. Thompson.
Thank you so much, Leanna. So happy to be here and speak to you. To those of you with the Center for Texas Studies and the library here in Fort Worth. I didn't know I would live in Texas. I didn't know I would write historical fiction. I grew up in Memphis, always fascinated with race relations. I didn't know I would write about race because it's always been an interest of mine. When you grow up in the shadows of all the music history of Memphis and then the civil rights history with Martin Luther King Jr., you can't escape the subject of race. My father was an English teacher, and he taught what was called then at the time Black English or Black literature, and he would go to conferences and talk about it, and so it just seemed like another extension of my childhood to write about someone. And when I found out about who Bass was, Bass Reeves, who was born in 1838 and died in 1910. I was watching CNN, and Morgan Freeman was asked at the end of an interview. He was promoting a movie at the time, and he was asked what his dream role would be. And he started talking about this guy, Bass Reeves. He said nobody's ever heard of him. But he was the most successful lawman of the West, and he was a former slave, and it just got me wondering. I love Morgan Freeman, and I trust his judgment. So I wondered, well, why is it nobody knows who he is? How did Morgan Freeman hear about him? And how could he be such a prominent figure and he's not a household name? So, I mean, we all have heard about Billy the Kid and Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and on, but we haven't heard about somebody who was far more influential. That was a great mystery to me. And I bought a book, bought a couple of books. There were, at the time, 11 years ago, there was a little short novel for kids, a biography for kids that talked about his life, and there was this very good book of nonfiction that it didn't present a narrative of his life, but it was a treasure trove of court documents, legends, newspaper clippings, kind of a wonderful hodgepodge of slices of his life, different versions of stories, and it just looked like a puzzle that needed to be put together. And I'm a storyteller, and I just wanted to put the pieces together and tell the story. And I felt an obligation now that I'd heard about him. I thought, over 100 years, not many people know that he exists. There's no story out there like a comprehensive narrative of his life, whether nonfiction or fiction. So I undertook the task of doing that without realizing that it would just overwhelm my life, but in a wonderful way, in a great way. But here I am 11 years later, and I've got 2 novels, and I'm working on the 3rd. I thought it would be 1 book, but it got out of control. And I realized to do his story justice, I couldn't focus on one part of his life for the arc of that narrative, that I would be cutting too much out. And I think that's one reason why you still don't see much, even in film, about him that's legitimate or thorough, because he lived such a long life. And his story is so rich, from his childhood as a slave, in his career lasting 32 years as a lawman. That's just unheard of. Most lawmen, lasted weeks, months, maybe a year or two, not 32. So his story just sucked me in. So thank you for joining me today so I could talk about it and talk a little bit of how I kind of remembered him. And the title of this presentation, the Bass Reeves Trilogy, The Rememory of a Legend, I was thinking of Toni Morrison's Beloved. And I just want to share a little passage from that. And I feel like that's what's happened to me. I have remembered him, or there's been some rememory. From Beloved, there are two characters speaking here, Setha and her daughter Denver. And her daughter Denver asks, "What were you praying for, ma'am?" And Setha, the main character of the novel, "Not for anything. I don't pray anymore. I just talk." "What were you talking about?" "You won't understand, baby." "Yes, I will. I was talking about time. It's so hard for me to believe in it. Some things go, pass on. Some things just stay. I used to think it was my rememory. You know, some things you forget, other things you never do, but it's not. Places are still there. If a house burns down, it's gone, but the place, the picture of it stays, and not just in my rememory, but out there in the world. What I remember is a picture floating around there, out there, outside my head. I mean, even if I don't think it, even if I die, the picture of what I did or knew or saw is still out there, right in the place where it happened. Can other people see it? Asked Denver. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. 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 So, I'm not remembering my life. I'm remembering when I'm writing on this project, I'm remembering, America's life. His lifespan, like I said, 1838 to 1910, so much change. And he was born on the frontier of Arkansas, at Van Buren, which is right outside of Fort Smith, Arkansas, right there by the border of what was then Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. So when he becomes a lawman years later after the Civil War, beginning in 1875, he is a U.S. Deputy Marshal in Indian Territory. So that was the Wild West, and it was the largest federal jurisdiction in American history, remains so. So it was a wild, large territory that consisted of what bordered on Arkansas and Texas, the 5 civilized tribes, so to speak: Chickasaw Nation, Creek Nation, Seminole Nation, Chickasaw Nation. Did I say Creek? Cherokee Nation. All right, so those 5, and then territory beyond that for eventually for other tribes to settle in terms of reservations where they were placed later. So that was his area, his turf. He did migrate into Texas when his master moved, and he's given away from one master to his son. So he's given from one master to another master. He stays within the family, but the 2 men are drastically different. And in an excerpt that I share with you, you'll see how I've rendered them quite differently. But the son lives in Texas. So he lives in Texas for a while outside of Paris, Texas, near the border, near the Red River. So I'm writing about America's memory. I buy one book that shares a lot of pieces. I get another book that shares a little bit, but not much more. And ultimately, I needed to do some archival research. I go to books written at the time, frontier people who were writing about their life, books about anything, you name it, that existed in that time period, about Native American Indians, about ultimately the Civil War. And it was a nasty rabbit hole. It just one topic led to another, to another, to another. So, and not trying to tell Bass Reeves' long story. I am telling America's story as well, because so much transpires over his lifetime, so many changes. So I've written 2 books so far. I'm writing the third, Follow the Angels, Follow the Doves. That follows his early years from birth until the Civil War. And his master was going off to war, to the Civil War. So he took Bass Reeves with him as his body servant. And I just felt like I had to tell this to complement what we know about his life as a lawman, to help explain how he could become such a masterful lawman. Why is it that he was better prepared in the Old West, dealing with outlaws, dealing with the terrain, the unknown terrain, so to speak? How is it that he could be more successful as a former slave than his white counterparts? Well, for one, Native Americans preferred working with a black lawman rather than a white one. So they were more open to share their knowledge of whom they had seen moving about, roaming about. So that was one advantage that he had. Another advantage was his skin. Very few people would expect a black lawman. So he learned to use his skin as camouflage. And he would learn too to really play it savvy and put on disguises as a tramp or a cowboy, so that he could get close enough to the outlaws to avoid violence whenever possible. He really wanted to avoid violence. He was aware he's a black man. Sure, this country's open enough for me to work on the frontier as a deputy, but not so open that he could become a marshal. And maybe at some point they might get tired of him arresting and killing white men. He arrested and killed many other men, but he was always sensitive to what the public view might be or might turn to with his work. So he was careful. He didn't want to kill anybody if he didn't have to. And because of this ethic that he had, Art Burton, and I'll show his book cover. There's Bass Reeves himself, looking very distinguished. This is what he looked like when he wasn't rounding up bad guys. He dressed up for church. He was a very faithful man. That's not where I wanted to go just yet. I kind of wanted to share the image. Art Burton, who wrote Black Gun, Silver Star, and also Black, Red, and Deadly. These are the best books about, if you just want like pure history about Bass Reeves. Black Gun, Silver Star was my Bible, my go-to. I carried it around for years. I did other research, but he did so much. This is what influenced me to want to tell Bass Reeves' story. So I decided Follow the Angels, Follow the Doves needed to be told so that we could believe that he would be prepared to take on that dangerous environment. And then Hell on the Border takes place during the peak of his career, 1883, 1884, where he's capturing the worst of the worst. And there's a little turning point in his career. I don't want to give anything away, but there's a reason why everything hinges on that time period to set up the finale of the book 3. So I would like to start by reading just a little bit from Follow the Angels, Follow the Doves, so you get a feel of the book, and then I'll talk about the sources that I relied upon to write what I did. I think that's how I'd like to go about how I share this. So before I read this one little part, I do want to explain why I refer to Bass's mother as Perlalee with a spell it Pearlalee, his mother, Perlalee Stewart. Now, from R.T. Burton's book, Black Gun, Silver Star, he spells it Paralee, P-A-R-A. Paul L. Brady, a descendant of Bass Reeves, his great nephew, who was a judge, he wrote a book, A Certain Blindness. It's no longer in print, but he spelled it the way I chose to spell it, as a Perlalee. Now, in another book, Paul Brady decided to change the name spelling to Paralee to match R.T. Burton's. So maybe he realized the family had been spelling the name wrong all these years, right? But I noticed in also in other documents that I had seen, in census documents, her last name was sometimes spelled as Stewart or Stewart with a UA. Now, I chose Perlalee, and I wanted to explain up front why and show an epigraph that I have for the book that comes from Moby Dick, written in the time of his life, of Bass Reeves's life. Methinks that in looking at things spiritual, we are too much like oysters, observing the sun through the water, and thinking that thick water the thinnest of air. Methinks my body is but the lees of my better being. In fact, take my body who will, take it, I say, it is not me. So, despite even yet another version, Paralee, P-A-R-I, on her tombstone, I guess people decided to spell it in any way. I chose Perlalee because there's a running theme throughout the book to Moby Dick. There's a pearl here in Bass Reeves, and I kind of like that metaphor with his mother. Here's the opening about Bass Reeves. All day long on the day of the great hailstorm of 1838, the sky over Van Buren, Arkansas had been a slate of soft, even gray, like the neck feathers of a loggerhead shrike, what slaves called a butcher bird, except for the signs of color and calm. None of the few hundred residents could know by late afternoon windows would need shuttering, or that tomato and strawberry plants would be lost if not protected by wagon cover, or that at the wharf an anchored steamboat would be put out of commission with bent smokestacks and a cracked paddle wheel, or that lives would be lost, including a foal, a slave woman, and countless dogs and yard fowl. On the Reeves plantation, the cloud cover came only as a welcome reprieve from the July heat. Slaves in the fields laughed with the overseer and remarked on their good fortune that the sun was absent that day, loafing somewhere with the moon, fishing for stars maybe. The winds drifted in at midday, but not at a violent pitch. Then thunder rolled up, followed by a light rain and distant flashes of lightning, buried high in the clouds, not in streaks, but pulses like fireflies. With the sky quickly turning darker and lighter in swirls, it happened in seconds, hail the size of hen eggs. Some had concentric circles in them, giving the appearance of eyeballs, while others were spiked, resembling enormous brown widow egg sacs. Mostly, they looked like cotton bolls, perfectly picked and dropped from heaven. Pearlie Stewart watched it commence from the back door of William Reeves's plantation house, where she had been working in the kitchen, still able in her 9th month of pregnancy to sit and peel potatoes and shell peas. Master Reeves ran from the parlor to join Pearlie at the door to see what the commotion was, the beating of hail on the ground and on the roofs of things, with the cries of things scattering for the trees, with the shredding of trees. Above all of that, she heard Master Reeves pray. Minutes later, the hail stopped, but the rain lashed in long sheets for hours afterward. Then the calm returned, the rain merely drizzling before it soon stopped altogether at dusk. The temperature dropped throughout the night, so the next day felt like April. That was when Pearlie went into labor on the spring-like day in July that followed the great hailstorm of 1838. Not in the slave quarters, but in the modest comfort and privacy of her parents' cabin, a privilege Master Reeves had bestowed on them due to their age and faithful service. She gave birth to her 3rd but only living child, a son, and named him Bass Reeves, her father's name. Bass Reeves the elder was tall, dark-skinned, and sinewy, and was remembered for his predilection for sugar cane, taking up tobacco only when sugarcane was no longer in season. Each fall, beginning with its first harvest, he'd carry a cane stalk with him wherever he went and would use it as a walking stick until he'd chewed it all the way down and would start on another and another till winter, which was how he acquired the nickname Sugar. No one but Master Reeves called him Bass anymore, not even Sugar's wife, Jane Reeves, though when Master Reeves called him, he called him Old Bass. Bass Reeves the infant was first held by his aunt, Tottie Stewart, the seamstress and midwife on the plantation, and with Sugar's favorite vine cutter, she cut the cord. While she cleaned the baby and swaddled him, Pearlie's mother began preparing the placenta, boiling it right away with garlic cloves, then later serving it to Pearlie, cubed with collard greens. By the heft of her nephew, nigh 3 good cantaloupes, Toddy pronounced he'd be as tall as his grandfather and as big and strong as his father, his enormous baby hands and feet, clear stamps of greatness. Pearlie's husband, John Michael Stewart, had been sold at the beginning of the year to a plantation 20 miles south of them, with assurances from Master Reeves that every Christmas she and John Michael could be reunited for the day. Pearlie cried with her newborn as she pressed him to her chest, his soft, warm flesh like John Michael's flesh, and the flesh of their 2 previous children. She knew for certain now, God remembered. She missed John Michael, wishing she could name their baby after him, but she was afraid that if she did, Master Reeves would eventually sell him away too. Master Reeves took to Sugar, or Old Bass, like he took to no other slave, better even than he did to most white folks, which was why Master Reeves had invited him, along with Jane, to take his family name, and honored Sugar and Jane had taken it. So it was settled. Bass Reeves would be Bass Reeves, though she would always say it broke her heart. So there's a lot of truth and a lot of fiction in what I just read. There was no hailstorm that announced his birth, but Bass Reeves is such a miracle of a man that he was able to do what he did during his lifetime, that I felt his birth needed to be honored in a spectacular way to match the legends and the records that would come later in the story. I didn't want the book to start flatly. He was born in 1838. We know it was July. We know his grandparents were favored, and his mother worked for the mistress. So he was born with a little privilege. They had their own cabin, his grandparents. So that's why I invented the hailstorm. I was living in Texas. I went back to school, and that's what brought me to Texas. I chose the University of North Texas for a reason, because they allowed creative work as a dissertation. I wanted to write, I thought at the time, one Bass Reeves novel, and I wanted to be in his backyard so I could tour Texas and Oklahoma and Arkansas when I needed to for research, get a look of the land, the lay of the land, so to speak. And during this time, my wife and I have our first child, and then our second child, because I'm still working on this project. And I'm learning a lot about childbirth and about placenta, and she's new agey, you know. So she, you know, had heard that it's really good for the mother to have placenta pills. And so you've got to ask for the placenta. And so we had a cooler at the hospital and kept the placenta. And yes, I did my research on how to cook. I didn't cook it with collard greens. Don't go that far now, but I did cook it. So, and then dehydrated it, shaved, ground it down in an old coffee grounder, and encapsulated that so she could have her placenta pills. And I'm writing this, and I'm thinking I need to work in the placenta history of, for centuries or millennia, women have been using that to help them overcome the after effects of childbirth. So that's why I work some of my own personal history in there like that. And also, while I was living in Texas, I experienced a couple of hailstorms. So I worked that in. I had just moved from Alabama to Texas, and I got into black widow spiders, brown widow spiders, because they were, I saw them there. And so when I was looking at large hail that fell in Denton, Texas at the time, looked like large brown widow egg sac. So some of my personal experience, there's every chapter in my books has some kind of personal anecdote. There's research involved in some way like that. Now, let me go back. A couple of books inform me. If you can see this, I'll make it bigger. When I was at University of North Texas, I decided I'm going to do this project right. And I'm going to immerse myself in that time period and never leave it if I can help it. So every course I took, Native American literature, or it was 19th century literature of some sort. I was reading about Moby Dick. I was reading the slave narratives, everything to learn about the history, learn the words they use for things, and what life was like, etc. So I do want to share how Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs helped me. From Frederick Douglass's My Bondage and My Freedom, I have this little passage. My mother had a strong hold on Old Master. She was considered a first-rate cook, and she really was very industrious. She was therefore greatly favored by Old Master. She was the only mother who was permitted to retain her children around her. That meant a lot to me when I read this book, because I thought his story in a way matched up with what we knew about Bass Reeves, that his grandparents and his mother and his aunt, those are real historical figures, were prominent slaves on that plantation in Van Buren, Arkansas. His mother was the mistress's servant, And then his aunt was the seamstress, like I say in the book, and cook. So they had important roles and they had some sway. And so his mother really politicked for Bass Reeves to be the master's personal servant when he grew up. So there was a bit of sway there. And because she was allowed to be a mother to her son, and not all slaves had that good fortune. Certainly, Frederick Douglass was ripped away from family after a while. Harriet Jacobs, you usually see that rupture in their lives. Bass Reeves was fortunate that he had that anchor of family around him throughout his childhood. So it was important to me to find historical stories that were similar so I could make sure mine was authentic. And based on the fact that his life was a little easier, I was concerned. I didn't want anyone thinking that I was making light of slavery. Being sensitive to my own race, I didn't want anybody thinking that I was apologist or something and just trying to paint a rosier picture. So this meant the world to me too when I read that what Harriet Jacobs said. I was born a slave, but I never knew it till 6 years of happy childhood had passed away. So there's precedent. Bass Reeves isn't alone to have had a pretty solid upbringing. He does adopt the slave of life and is tortured in many aspects, mainly psychologically, but there are other aspects as well, physical, etc. But I didn't want it to start. I didn't want to change that and make it all miserable and torture from the beginning, because I'm thinking, well, so why does he wait to try to escape? He was a slave up until in his 20s during the Civil War. So I wanted to have him settled a bit before that rupture happened. And just to share a little bit of my thinking, when his master, that he did view as somewhat of a father figure, gives him to his son, I decided that would be the rupture, that would when his somewhat happier time would shift and become much harder for him. Life under the sun, who I found in a document, in the letters, the Civil War manuscripts, from my archival research, I discovered that George Reeves, that son, the second master, was relieved of his duty during the Civil War because he was belligerent, had a history of drinking too much, and was belligerent with a superior. All right. That gave me everything I needed to know as a storyteller. All right, so the father, the first one, the father figure, William Reeves, will be nicer or gentler master, insidious in his own ways. I get into that. But the son, a meaner sort, an alcoholic, belligerent. And I thought that would make a more interesting story, seeing the two different versions. So what I'm really hoping to do is to show the different sides of slave life. I'm not trying to say slave life was always this or that. I'm trying to show, I mean, he does literally move from one plantation to another. So I want to show that the treatment differed, just as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs talked about when they went from from being owned, from one master to the next, that life could be quite different, depended on how religious one was. Typically, the more religious, the worse it was. So I needed to work in that information. All right. So another passage from Follow the Angels, Follow the Doves, to kind of share with you how my reading and research influenced my work. Reading Moby Dick, when I was thinking about that son, that the ego of that son, I mean, I'm thinking of Captain Ahab. Here's a man who wanted to keep under wraps a man far more powerful than he was. At that time, during the Civil War, Bass Reeves, 22, he's an expert marksman. His first master found out when Bass Reeves became his personal servant and bodyguard, because he realized that Bass Reeves naturally had a gift as a marksman. And I'm gonna share a passage about that. So he ends up his first master taking him around to turkey shoots in the different Indian nations, and he would enter Bass Reeves into these turkey shoots with pretty good assurance that Bass Reeves would win it, and he would win the pot of money, the reward. And so he made a little money off of Bass Reeves. Now, Bass Reeves is getting such great experience with weapons here as a slave, which is extremely unique. And of course, this is going to benefit him later as a lawman. He was ambidextrous with a pistol and a rifle. He was 6'2", when the average man during the Civil War was about 5'7", 5'8". So he had the size, he had the ability. He was really an awesome figure. And I thought that really, Moby Dick informed me how smart and insidious that George Reeves, the son who was the second master, needed to be. And then also Henry David Thoreau's Walden was a tremendous help. Just to show you, you never know where you can get little gifts, where you can get a little jewel to use in something. So I'm reading about Thoreau's life on Walden, on that pond there in Massachusetts. And he's writing about watching the pond freeze over in the wintertime, and how these ice workers come out and saw up the pond in blocks and pack the blocks in hay to ship that ice off to various markets. And it dawns on me, well, I've got a wealthy master who could afford to purchase ice and have it shipped to him. And you think, well, did people do that on the frontier? Well, look, it's so important to get out in the world and not just rely on wonderful archival sources and libraries. But so my wife lived in Olathe, Kansas. She's from there. So we were going back to visit family over Christmas one time, and I visited the Mahaffey house. And this farmhouse was an old stagecoach stop on the Santa Fe Trail. So it was built in the 1860s. And so was this little building to the left of the house. That's an ice house. And he would have ice shipped to him from up north. So I'll put this with what Thoreau said. And I liked it as a metaphor for the sun. for slavery itself and the mentality that it would take for a white man to own another person and control that person and control that person's progeny, I thought ice was a perfect metaphor for that. And I also want to, before I start reading this passage that deals with guns and ice, I want to share this passage from Beloved. Then came the miracle. This is Paul D., if you've read the book. Then came the miracle. Standing in a street in front of a row of brick houses, he heard a white man call him, "Say there, yo," to help unload 2 trunks from a coach cab. Afterward, the white man gave him a coin. Paul D. walked around with it for hours, not sure what it could buy. A suit, a meal, a horse, and if anybody would sell him anything. So this reminded me, while I was writing the book, that about what slaves would know about by overhearing. Now, Bass Reeves was a personal servant, so he's up close to the privileged. That makes him privileged too, somewhat, as a slave. So he gets to benefit from the world that the master inhabits just by being literally there with him when he travels. But there's a limit to that. There's a limit, like understanding. You might know a little bit about money, but he wouldn't know the value. So much of that world of commerce would escape him. So I needed to remember that as well. And so those books helped me write this next section that I'm going to share with you. In addition to just the history of his going around to turkey shoots, I couldn't leave that out of the story. This is not the only time a turkey shoot appears in this book, but this is one. Master Reeves entered Bass into his first turkey shoot on the 1st of May in 1857. Lutherans of neighboring Fort Smith had set up the contest as a fundraiser for the construction of their church, and on the site of its future grounds, they hung turkeys by their feet from a clothesline tied between 2 sugarberry trees. The objective for the contestant was to shoot the head off a turkey from 100 feet, and whoever succeeded advanced to the next round and the next until there was a winner of the $20 prize. The turkeys shot in the contest were to be roasted over a pit for the Jubilee barn raising planned for the following day. A surprising number of contestants, 41 of 78, progressed to the second round, but only 3 made it past the third. A first lieutenant in the 7th Infantry, an English wayfarer dressed in tails and a top hat, and Bass Reeves. 4 rounds later, the Fort Smith officer was disqualified when his shot didn't completely sever the gobbler's head from its neck, leaving it dangling by a string of wattle. Back and forth for over an hour, Bass and the Englishmen aimed their muskets and shot, while slave women sat nearby on upturned wicker baskets, plucking the turkeys as soon as they were untied from the clothesline and tossed in the mud at their feet, the feathers mounting into a brown heap as high as a haystack. The crowd gathering behind Bass and the Englishmen was estimated at 300 white spectators, far greater than the town's population, and all about them, quietly perched on tree limbs and fence rails, were scores of crows and blackbirds, while a thick funnel cloud of buzzards floated in rotation above them, no longer startled by the gunfire. The crowd had been largely polite throughout the event until someone yelled, "We need an American in the race," which was quickly answered by another fellow saying, "Oh, we got an American. The problem is he ain't human." Laughter erupted, but it didn't slow or distract Bass because Master Reeves thought differently and Bass thought differently. So those people could think how they wanted. They could live like frogs and crickets. A body eventually stopped hearing, like water boiling the way water boiled, like water trickling over smooth stones, like thunder even after a while, like birds just waiting, no matter. But the Lutheran Church of Fort Smith unexpectedly ran out of turkeys. All 100 of them, donated by a local farmer, were dead. The minister huddled with the deacons while the crowd offered up a variety of solutions, from dogs to chickens they could fetch from home. But the minister broke from his huddle and declared the contest a tie. The crowd moaned, but the Englishman immediately removed his hat in a dramatic show of relief and, appearing much shorter now without his hat, shook Bass's hand. With more turkeys than could ever be eaten at a jubilee, the minister invited the winners to haul away as many as they wanted. The Englishman graciously declined the offer, but Master Reeves accepted both shares and directed Bass to draw up the wagon. Since he was keeping their portion of the prize money, Master Reeves said Bass could have all but one. On their way back to the plantation, Bass turned in his seat to eye his bounty, plucked white and dotted with blood, and if he saw flies, he'd remove his wide-brimmed hat and shoo them off. On the ferry crossing the Arkansas River, Bass got down from his seat and dunked each bird off the side to rinse it. After Master Reeves paid the ferryman, he looked at Bass as they proceeded again on land. "It's like I financed a war," he said. They rode for a time in the silence of horse hooves and wagon squeak. "It's not your fault, Bass. I'm not saying it's your fault, but it's not mine either. How could I imagine somebody would match you for so long? You can't imagine the expense of ammunition these days. You just can't." "No, sir, master, don't imagine I can," Bass said, and he turned once more to check on his turkeys. He had never expected to receive any of the prize money anyway. What would Bass do with money? It was reward enough to be given the opportunity to leave the plantation and compete like a free man, but to perform in the turkey shoot as well as the most perfect white man, and then get to go home with half a wagon of fresh meat to share with all his fellow slaves, so that for a moment they could feel free and perfect too. That surpassed what he'd ever dreamed possible. When they arrived at the plantation, Bass could barely remain seated, eager to begin unloading the turkeys so that he could begin gutting and cleaning them before he lost sunlight. By that time, the slave day would be winding down, and he'd have help preparing the pits with firewood. He let the horses continue to advance up the lane at a quick canter, but not one dog ran out to greet them. "Easy," Master Reeves said. "Oh, yes, sir," Bass said, pulling on the reins to slow the horses to a trot, and Bass spotted a wagon ahead, behind the house, parked in the shade of the oak tree between the stable and the ice house. Its horses were unhitched, likely feeding in the stable, while Master Reeves's whippets were gathered beneath the wagon, licking the grass. Bass pulled their wagon alongside it, and Master Reeves stood from his seat to peer down into it. Despite the heat, the entire floor of the wagon was dark with water and strewn with hay. Bass could see inside the wagon without standing. "My ice," Master Reeves said. He smiled and climbed down, using a wheel spoke as a step. "What do you know? They're early." Bass watched him unfasten the door to the ice house and step inside, the dogs scurrying in a bunch to follow him in. "Come here, Bass," Master Reeves said. Bass jumped to the ground, and before he'd reached the threshold of the ice house, waves of cooler air curled out against him. It was his first time to step inside the square limestone structure, which was much smaller than it had appeared from the outside, and darker, even with the door open, because of its thick walls without windows. In the center of the dirt floor were hay-packed cakes of ice stacked as tall as he was. This'll make summer bearable, Master Reeves said. He patted Bass on the back, and Bass had to catch his breath from the surprise of his touch. This was once a pond in Massachusetts, but we'll make something much sweeter with it, you'll see. Yes, sir, Master, Bass said politely, smiling. Master Reeves turned to go, and Bass backed away to let him have the lead. Following the dogs, Bass latched the door. A man as well dressed as Master Reeves, only younger, in his 30s and sporting a red vest and a dark mustache, was exiting the rear door of the house and laughing as he spoke to two poorly dressed white men who were trailing behind him, their shirts rolled up at the sleeves and drenched with sweat. The well-dressed man seemed vaguely familiar to Bass, with familiar, small, dark eyes darting back and forth between him and Master Reeves as he walked in their direction. Well, goodness gracious, George, Master Reeves said, why didn't you send word you were coming? I wouldn't have gone off to Fort Smith today if I'd known. He and the well-dressed man met each other with a hug, and Bass knew now it was Master George, the master's son. Bass had seen him over the years passing through the plantation, but always unexpectedly, ghostly, a momentary sighting. The black sheep of the family, Bass had heard his mother say, and not in a good way. Then off into a carriage or on a horse, his mystery always a fast one. The other white men quietly stood back and waited for Bass to be addressed. It's a good thing I showed when I did, Master George said, because no one was around to take charge and help these men unload their ice. Don't you have an overseer? Mother didn't know. Master Reeves nodded. Thank you, son, he said. He turned to the men. I suppose I owe you. Master George appeared neglected for the moment, and his eyes wandered along the ground, snake-like, to Bass's shoes, going up his trouser legs and linen shirt to his now downturned face. Bass took his hat off and wiped his forehead with his kerchief, pretending not to notice the attention. Master George walked up to Bass and stood so close to him that he met Bass's still downturned eyes. Mother says you're quite the gunslinger. Let me rephrase that. Mother says father says that. But what do you say? Oh, no, sir, no gunslinger, not at all. Do you think my father is wrong about you? Bass stared at the ground. No, sir, he knows a lot about a lot. Then how do you explain this ability you have? Bass shrugged. Can hold a gun up straight is all. Don't know enough to explain it, sir. Master George, sir, I just do as I'm told. I see. Master George kicked at the ground with the heel of his boot and rested his hands on his hips. Shooting a man is not the same as shooting a turkey. Bass nodded. Art thou a silkworm? Master George asked with heat. Bass's back stiffened as he looked up at him. Master George appeared as sincere in the framing of his eyes and mouth as a preacher, but Bass understood about as much as if Master George were Mexican. Dost thou spin thy own shroud out of thyself? Master George said. Look at thy bosom. Bass prayed for patience and understanding. He had to say something. It would be expected, but he could think of nothing. He could think of sugar, what sugar would do, what sugar would say, and nothing else. So he grinned wide and said, I know you a busy man, Master George, so can I do something for you, maybe get something for you? Master George inched closer by puffing out his chest. That was Herman Melville, boy. I'm speaking of the great Moby Dick. I want to know your opinion. If what Captain Ahab says speaks to you. You do have an opinion, don't you, Bass? You are Bass, aren't you? Old Bass's Grand Bass? I'm talking to the right inward, I hope. Afraid of how this man would twist his words if he used any, Bass continued to nod. You aren't going to answer me in speech, boy? Yes, sir, Master George. Name Bass. Yes, sir. Master George nodded, then nodded again as if to make his nodding clear. Melville also says that a whale's case, if the whale is a large buck of a whale, will yield about 500 gallons of sperm. Not speaking, but looking away at Master Reeves, counting out paper bills into the hand of one of the workmen. Bass eyed Master George again, then looked away again. Master George laughed with such small teeth. Books are funny, he said. So that's the introduction of the son, George Reeves. I also looking at the time just to see how I'm doing. Also looked at nonfiction, like Africans and Seminoles, Storm and Stampede on the Chisholm. And these books helped me. He gets introduced to Native Americans on turkey shoots when he travels. Now this one scene was on the frontier there of Arkansas, right there at the border. So there's some influence from Indian Territory in terms of having a turkey shoot there, but most of the turkey shoots were in Indian Territory. So he gets exposed to the culture and the landscape there, and that's going to prove helpful later in life when he's a lawman in and out of that territory. And it's important to know about the Seminoles particularly, because his goal as a slave, when he starts thinking about trying to escape, he hears enough from the master's talk and from other slaves when he's a body servant during the Civil War, that Seminole Nation would be the promised land. That would be the equivalent of up north, for the slaves in the deep South. The Seminoles treated their slaves differently. A lot of the Native American tribes had slaves, but the Seminoles treated their slaves way differently than everybody else. The Cherokees, the Chickasaw, they could be brutal with their slaves like white men. They learned how to be slave masters from whites. The Seminoles would have slaves, but they would be like sharecroppers. Like the slaves would live independently nearby, and they would have their farm, and they would work the farm, and then they would give a portion of what they grew to their owners. But there wasn't and they lived in like separate communities. They didn't chain them and watch over them their whole lives and whip them. You don't have the history of that kind of torture there. So the slaves lived in their own communities, grew their own work, and then gave like a tax, gave up some of the crop. And because the Seminoles had that kind of relationship, they often would intermarry, and they didn't have that sense of racism passed down, that you got to look at the black man as another thing, another type of race or an animal or whatever. And so they would often intermarry, and that was common, that was natural. There was no taboo about it. So if Bass Reeves could escape from his master, George Reeves, that becomes the goal. Can he get to Seminole Nation, where he's got to watch out for some of these other Native American tribes who have unfortunately inherited the white man's racism, uh, they might claim him for their own slave, to be their own slave. But if he could make it to Seminole Nation, he could live freely. So that becomes his goal. I mean, if he can make it to Indian Territory, that's better than the U.S. for sure. But the promised land really was Seminole Nation. And in that book, I learned about an interesting place in Florida, due to the Trail of Tears. There's many good reasons why the tribes were shipped away from the Deep South. And one reason that we don't really learn, at least I didn't in history, in Florida, because the Seminoles had this friendly relationship with their slaves or with former slaves and didn't mind intermarrying, this posed a threat. The white slaveholders believed in nearby states, Georgia, Carolinas, Alabama, etc. They didn't like this example of, and there was this specific place called the Negro Fort. I'll read a little bit from Africans and Seminoles by Littlefield. It says, it also became apparent to Southern slaveholders that the black settlements in the Seminole country and elsewhere in Florida represented a threat to slavery in the nearby states. The British built a fort near the mouth of the Apalachicola and manned it. This is in the Panhandle there, real closer to Alabama, and manned it with refugee red sticks. They're blacks and runaway slaves. So slaves in nearby states they heard about it and they would try to escape to Negro Fort was called. So on July 27, 1816, American forces leveled it, killing 270 living there, capturing 64 of its inhabitants. Eventually, Andrew Jackson would go on and wage his Seminole Wars. But that's what's driving. Let's get the Native Americans out of here. That's one purpose. They can't be friendly to the slaves if we want to treat the slaves differently and try to convince them that this is normal, natural, and therefore will accept it. So that informs something I'm about to read from my next book, Hell on the Border, and also Storm and Stampede on the Chisholm. So life there, this frontier writer writes about observing the Native Americans and their life I'm sorry, the word is, I keep thinking plantation, or reservation, I'm sorry. Observing life on the reservations, what their new life is like for these Native Americans being, trying to resettle and find a life. And the federal government wants to make them passive. And to do that, they need to make them helpless. So, the buffalo are killed off. That was the first thing. So how are they going to live? How are they going to eat? Well, the federal government would have these beef issue days. They would bring in all the cattle, and this would be their food for a month until the next beef issue day. And they would bring in these steer to the reservation, and then the Native Americans would celebrate all this meat coming to them. And it was a gruesome celebration day. And when I heard about it, I felt obligated to work this in. I mean, we have some terrible sins, to pay for in this country, not just obviously for slavery, for genocide and the treatment of Native Americans. And I just view this project, this is an American story. Why do I want to tell it as a white man? I do love my country despite its many flaws, and we need to know our past so we don't commit the crimes and the sins again. We keep doing it. But so that's part of my obligation and motivation for writing this book and trying to be as true as possible to what we knew of the time and the real history of the time. Now, the Negro Fort was in the early 1800s, but I wanted to work it in my novel on Hell on the Border. There were a couple of places where I needed to fill the reader in. So if the reader didn't read Follow the Angels, Follow the Doves first, they would be up to speed about his previous life, how he was a slave, body servant during the Civil War, how he escaped, where he went, why Seminole Nation. And so here's a section from that book where I share this beef issue information, and I share information about an historical figure, old Caesar or Caesar Brunner, was a Seminole rancher. And I don't know if for sure he carried any of his cattle to any of these beef issue days on the reservations, but it's believable, it's plausible. He could have. So I tied the two things together with the connection with this Seminole rancher that Bass ends up befriending, and this man's prior history of what he's heard back in Florida. Right now in Hell on the Border, to set the scene, he's tracking down a cold-blooded killer, one that Bass Reeves said later in his life that was the meanest man he ever dealt with, Jim Webb, who was a rancher and a murderer. He killed his neighbor, who was a black circuit preacher, because he accidentally let a brush fire get out of control and get onto that ranch land where he was a foreman. And Jim Webb was hot-headed and racist and killed the preacher. So just think about the world that we haven't been taught. Maybe that would help you understand why I just felt I had to tell the story. So wait a second. This goes against everything that I've read in literature and in history. We have a black deputy he's tracking a prominent white man for killing a black man. That blew me away. And I wanted to spend time in Bass's head, in the character. I wanted to know how he lived this kind of life, how it unfolded, how he dealt with all of the risks. It just won me over. So anyway, here's a little. So he's just been talking to some Choctaw maize farmers for some information, and he's just now leaving them. He regarded the young maize fields to the left and right of the road, so many thousands of green sprouts on brown rows that flowed away as if forever. He squinted, and it was how an ocean might look when the mind remembered. Each one of those plants would grow to become so burdened with life, it would want nothing more than to lie down and die, like the hominy in these sacks across his lap. It just bought a couple of sacks for his mother. She loves hominy. Or grits, like the hominy in these sacks across his lap, yet there was so much hope for them now. He passed the barbed wire fence he'd passed earlier, and it was still as peculiar to his eyes as telegraphic lines were if he looked up and saw stripes on the sky, as if it were a shirt. Cattle, too skinny to be cattle, were chewing out one hard scrabble existence, like everything else. 14 years had passed already since the House Committee on Indian Affairs had initiated a civilizing policy for about 9,000 Arapaho, Cheyenne, Apache, Kiowa, and Comanche Indians who had been relocated to the Indian Territory just west of the Chickasaw Nation. To prevent the Indians from returning to the plains out of starvation, Congress approved an annual subsistence of 730 pounds of beef on the hoof for every man, woman, and child. As a result, beef issue days on the reservation had become both carnivalesque and sacrosanct. The first time Bass had attended one was in November of 1870. His friend, old Caesar, or Caesar Bruner, a black Seminole rancher and band chief, had won the bid to supply the cattle to the Cheyennes and Arapahoes that month. He had been 16 in 1829 when he walked the Trail of Tears from Florida to the Territory. He eventually settled on Salt Creek in the Seminole Nation and founded Brunertown, where he found Bass in 1862, standing and shivering in rag clothes, splattered with patroller blood at the edge of a meadow with pistols in his hands. Bass was waiting for the dark Negro Indian man with white hair and earrings to turn his buckskin Spanish Mustang away from his inspection of grazing longhorn calves to notice him there at the edge between meadow and creek. Bass needed everything, food, clothes, refuge, all he had eaten after escaping his master's plantation in Texas 3 days earlier was raw turtle meat. For payment, he had the 2 pistols he had taken from his master and overseer, a nickel and ivory Colt Dragoon 44 and a Smith & Wesson 22, which he held at the ready as if they couldn't possibly be empty. 4 other black Seminoles on Dunn, Grullo, and Roan Mustangs joined in a semicircle about old Caesar. They were younger, in their 20s like Bass, and spoke in a tribal language Bass hadn't heard before. When old Caesar at last noticed Bass, it was their secret. Old Caesar calmly studied him as he had the calves before walking his Mustang from the group and approaching the creek. He was a lean and slight man with unlevel eyes. His left one was positioned a little higher than the right and was slanted like a Chinaman's. Bass stood straighter and tightened his grips. He checked on the others, but like the elder, none sat on saddles with rifle scabbards or even had a pistol out of its holster. Old Caesar stopped his horse 2 horse lengths away. "Estonco," he said. The half circle of riders looked over, but without panic. Bass remembered hello from the Cherokees and General Pike's 1st and 2nd Mounted Rifles, whom he helped train at Fort Washita during the war. So Bass said, "Osio," to let the man know he was friendly to Indians. Maybe the man would also notice the beaded necklace they had given him. "Seminole?" old Caesar asked in a voice that was deeper than Bass's, despite his size. Bass shook his head, afraid he'd lost his way and hadn't reached the Seminole Nation after all, not if this elder could mistake him to be a Seminole. "Slave," Bass corrected, which appeared to delight the man. "Seminole," old Caesar repeated. "Runaway, yes?" he asked, nodding insistently. Bass smiled now at the young maize on waves, at the old memory of him and old Caesar reaching an understanding for the first time. He patted the hominy across his lap. "Jesus a-comin' and I's a-goin'," he began to sing in no more than a murmur, praying for that heaven place. Seminole had been the first of many words that old Caesar and later old Caesar's wife Nancy Lincoln would teach him. Yes, Bass had once been a Seminole. Now he wasn't. Now Jim Webb was one. I hope you enjoyed that. I appreciate your attention. Thanks for showing up. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Well, Sidney, to start things off, I have a question, and this is based on something you mentioned sort of early on in your talk. You talked about being in Texas and being centrally located to the places that you were going to be writing about. And I wondered if you would just say a word about the importance of place and actually laying eyes on those sites that you would be talking about and how that informs your work. I'm sure you visited Fort Smith and Fort Sill and cruised through former Indian territory to get the lay of the land.
Absolutely. It's extremely valuable to see for yourself a landscape, just to see how rounded the mountains are, or how low or brown or whatever the landscape is, how it's flat before the hills, or maybe it's fractured with streams. You need these details to win over a reader, not just for the reader who knows the area, but you need to pepper in concrete details so that they've got a backdrop, that they can see this story, and it keeps the story vivid and continuous in the reader's mind. And any kind of unique detail you might spot, that the shape of a mountain looks like this, then you can have a character. Oh, that's the hill that looks like a saddle. And then anybody who knows the area can get excited. It is. How does he know that? So you're going to meet people who are going to be knowledgeable about some fact, some bit of history that you wouldn't have heard or found otherwise. It's so invaluable to get out, to take a trip and feel like it's your territory. You've got personal memories now of being there. So now it's your story. It's how you can make your story tangible and like a lived thing, like it's your memory. You've got to live the life as a writer and incorporate these places. So you have memories of people and places, and like going to the McAfee house in Kansas. It's not in Texas, not in Indian territory. My characters, these historical figures, might not have ever been there before, but it doesn't matter. They're part of that time period, and they can give you insights into how people lived. So I say if you're writing historical fiction or you're writing a history, don't just read nonfiction or don't just read fiction. You read everything that you can read, you can get your hands on, because you never know what kind of detail you're going to glean from somewhere, whether it's like that book about, on the Chisholm, the Stampede book, like it's basically someone's diary, but their insights as just a common person living on the frontier, their insights have value. So don't be a snob. Don't think you've only got to read the books that everybody says you have to read. You need to get out and read lesser known books and look at anything you can get your hands on, I say.
Good. Okay. Yeah. Okay, we have a question from the audience, and that is, did you find or interview any of Bass's descendants?
I did not. Now Paul Brady is the only one I know of. I read his work, and this is going to sound awful, but it was littered with so many errors, so many or details that went counter to everything that was provable. Like, we have census records, we have enough records, or enough interviews of Bass himself, because he was a well-known man in his day. I mean, when Teddy Roosevelt decided to trek through Indian Territory before it became a state, he asked he called on local lawmen to be his Secret Service agents for protection, and Bass Reeves was one of them. So, I mean, he was well known at the time. He's been whitewashed since, for reasons we can get into if you're interested. But so anyway, so we have enough recorded history, and I don't know if what Paul Brady was sharing, some of it may be like just confused, like, stories get passed down from generation to generation and details get fuzzy. And maybe there's some truth in there, here and there, but so much went against it that I was afraid. I didn't want what I saw to be the truth to be, or what I wanted to write. I didn't want it to be tainted by what a family member might want and feel obligated. I wanted to be an independent writer and write what I thought was honestly the truth. There are different varying versions of certain events. And I try to, especially a key one that happens in Hell on the Border. And I go with the one, not that's politically expedient, but the one I think happened based on the evidence. And I didn't want my decision-making being pulled a different direction by a family member, a loyalty or anything. And I spoke to Art Burton, and I am friends with him, and I value his work is sound, and almost everything that I ever found in the archives backed up what he said. I found a couple of little small discrepancies, but Art Burton, an African-American from Oklahoma, grew up hearing stories his father passed down to him and how his father heard about Bass Reeves, just kind of like, I guess they're a local lore. And so he grew up fascinated about who Bass Reeves was and decided to do homework. Now, this guy is an expert. He knows his stuff. And he didn't think much of those books either. So I just thought it was in the best interest of my project not to try to reach out to family members. And I will say that I did meet the great granddaughter of George Reeves, the slave master, at a conference. And this woman came up to me and said, I grew up hearing stories. We were so proud that Bass was our slave, and he loved our family and we loved him. And I'm just thinking to myself, whoa, it was nice meeting her. And I was glad that the family had these nice memories, but they had a biased view that Bass loved them. He may have appreciated certain things, but there was a love-hate. And again, I enjoyed meeting her, but I didn't want to get too close either with that, because I was probably going to write some things that she wouldn't like, and I don't want to offend anybody, but I wrote what I thought was true, that tells the story. So do I make changes? Do I add certain scenes like the hailstorm? Of course, I have to fill in there's a beautiful quilt that's been ravaged over time. We have some patches there that we've saved over time, but some patches are missing, and I have to supply patches. And I try to supply patches that I honestly think would fit the tone or fit his learning and allow me to be consistent with his story. Um, and I've tried to do my honest best. That's why I got my PhD, to help make sure that I knew enough about slavery and life around here and slave narratives that I could do his story justice. You know, I didn't want to just quickly spin a yarn. I like to tell stories and I like to write. And if I didn't write this story, I'd write another story. But I chose this and made this my life because I wanted to do it right and live in his backyard and sort of pretend that I'm breathing the same air that he breathed in some way. So I know I answered your question. I hope I answered it, man. I answered a few others. Sorry if I'm going off in different tangents, but that's what his story is. It's like so complex that it's like one story leads to another story, and I can't explain one thing without going into a bunch of other things. So I hope I've made a little bit of sense on what I'm doing. I hope so.
Well, with that answer, you touched upon our next question, which was, what were some of the most valuable archival resources that you found when you were researching? Do you have a top, maybe 2 or 3 collections or repositories that were particularly useful?
I can tell you that ancestry.com was helpful. That can lead you to a variety of sources that relate to different individuals. If like where somebody lived at a certain time, and you can find their address. You can ultimately find out like they're on the census and who lived with them. So you get a little snapshot of history. That was fun. The Texas State Library Archives and Commission, the National Archives Catalog. The National Archives Catalog has within it, tell you what, I'm going to I have something pulled up in case somebody asks me a question about this. The Western District of Arkansas, that federal court, ended up moving to Paris, Texas later. And over years, in Fort Smith and in Paris, you have a fire, a damage to records. So we've lost a lot of records, but we still have quite a few. And let's see. Let me see, where did I go? Right here. Okay. I'm going to go back to the share screen. And in the National Archives Catalog, I found this about Bass Reeves Jr. I'm sorry, I take that back. About Benjamin Reeves, or Benny, he was called, who was found guilty of murder. And this incident is in my 3rd book. At the tail end of Bass Reeves's life, he's away from home a lot. He's capturing bad guys. He's neglecting his own children. And one result is, unfortunately, that a few of his sons get into trouble. And this document here is about Ben Reeves. This is from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And Benny is a character in my 3rd book, and my second one, as a child in the second one, and then as an adult in the third one. And I love the details that you see here, what the officers are writing down, laughing and talking with other prisoners on the yards, laughing and talking while at work in barber shop. He ends up learning how to be a barber. And so that's helpful to know what he did in life, laughing and fooling in the laundry, and improper trafficking with another prisoner. All right, so his trouble isn't so bad. He's laughing a lot. He seems like a likable person. In fact, he seems a lot like his father. His father liked to laugh and tell stories and sing songs. So within both of the books, in his upbringing and also as an officer, he would like to tell jokes and stories and sing songs. And his mother so feared when Bass was a young boy that he was going to be an outlaw, because he loved to sing songs, as if he were singing a song from the point of view of an outlaw. So it's kind of interesting that there was the fear that he would go the wrong way. He goes the right way, but then now his sons go the wrong way. So he lived a long, interesting life and had to deal with a lot of contradictions, a lot of tragedy, a lot of achievement, and a lot of tragedy. But you can find so much online now. When you go to these archives, the Fort Worth now has in its collection the documents that survived the fires in Fort Smith. And if you want to read about any of the documents, the court documents from Fort Smith, then you can do that. There's some wonderful places you can go. Any of these battlefields, and when I was writing the Civil War scenes, I went. They have their own websites and archives, and I make use of them. I went to the University of Oklahoma's archives there on Oklahoma history, and that's wonderful. And I hear there's a really good one at the University of Arkansas in Little Rock, and Littlefield, Daniel Littlefield, the author of Africans and Seminoles, teaches there, and I'm going to be going there soon to get a little research for my third book. I hope I'm trying to give you a little bit of assortment. I've used so many different sources, but Art T. Burton, I probably turned to that book the most. He did a lot of legwork of digging around in archives. I did some too, but I didn't have to do as much. And I only learned about Bass Reeves because Art Burton decided to write that. If he hadn't written that book, nobody would be talking about him. That was the first book about Bass Reeves, and published in 2006, I believe. So we've only known about him for a little while. He was whitewashed out of history because a famed historian who wrote the so-called Bible of this time period of the Judge Parker's hanging, the hanging judge, that court in Fort Smith, Arkansas. He wrote this book and was really thorough about whites, with the white outlaws and the white lawmen who took part in that history. He only includes black lawmen who died in the course of their duty, and he includes, of course, all black outlaws, but he left out black lawmen who survived and thrived in their career, which obviously meant to leave out Bass Reeves, because he would have overshadowed all of his counterparts, the white marshals who had superiority over him. And I'm sure that's why, for political reasons, he was left out. But because of that, for 100 years, people would go to that book called Hell on the Border for information about the lawmen and the outlaws in that time period, about Bell Star or whoever else. And so that's why I call my second book Hell on the Border, the nickname for the jail in Fort Smith, because I kind of wanted to thumb my nose at S.W. Harmon, the historian that deliberately left Bass Reeves out, and therefore it gets left out of history. Because not only did he leave him out of that book, historians, lazy historians, please don't be lazy historians, assumed everything that mattered was in that book and didn't do their own legwork, didn't do their own homework, didn't do their own archival work to, to confirm the information, and ended up leaving him out in future books. So it's only because Art Burton wrote that book, Black Gun, Silver Star, that Morgan Freeman knows who he is. I know who he is. And, more and more people are starting to know who he is.
Well, and I think one of the comments helps support what you just said. One of our attendees said that your books sound very interesting, and she wants to start at book 1. She too is from Memphis, and she's the president of an African American Historical and Genealogical Society, Memphis chapter.
Yay.
She says she had heard of Bass Reeves, but did not realize there were any books. She has a member who's doing some research on Reeves, and one who went to Arkansas after he was mustered out from the Civil War, Cornelius Reeves. And she's wondering if you would share the name of that historical book on Bass Reeves again. I think that's the,
sure.
the Silver Star book.
I will. Art T. Burton is a good man. He's I didn't know, honestly, how he would take me. Am I encroaching on his territory or whatever? But he has taken me in as a confidant, and sometimes he shares a little information that didn't make his books, because he doesn't want that information to get lost. And he hopes it'll wind up, in mine or somewhere. Where did it go? I closed out of it. Oh, just give me 1 second. Can you see that?
No, are you sharing?
Okay, I thought I did, but let me try again. No, I guess I didn't. Can you see that?
Now, yes.
Okay, Art T. Burton. Now, Bass Reeves appears in one chapter in Black, Red, and Deadly, and he writes this book about Black and Indian gunfighters of the Indian Territory. So he talks about a lot of interesting figures, not just Bass Reeves, and but Bass Reeves is the central figure that he writes about in that book. And then he couldn't sit still with what he included in that book. He had so much more information that he decided to write Black Gun, Silver Star.
I see.
And this is the book. You don't get it thinking you're going to read a story. It's a compilation of so many different stories and accounts and details. But it's, like I say, it's a treasure trove for somebody like me who just wants the information. I don't need the story. I want to tell the story if I can, but it's so rich. You'll enjoy it.
Great. In fact, she has chimed in and said, wonderful, thank you.
Absolutely. Now,
and we've got several who have said how much they enjoyed your program. I think we've come to the end of our questions. So I just want to say thank you for spending your Saturday morning with us. Thank you to all of our guests who have been with us today. Again, tune in with us on May the 1st for our next lecture from Libby Willis. And Linda, do you have anything to add? Linda has had a technical difficulty, so she has had to leave us. But on behalf of Linda and the library and the Center for Texas Studies, I just want to say thank you all for being here with us. Thank you, Sidney, and everyone have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you again. Thank you.